something like that. Mrs. Munson, is that the hour of 2 o'clock being announced? Love the wind, the chimes. Westminster chimes, right? Delightful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce your librarian, Ms. Munson.
I'm just going to have a few announcements of things coming up at the library. So we have our Tech Talks that go on regularly, October 26th at 2:30 p.m. That's Thursday, or coming Thursday. We are going to be talking about GIMP, which is photo editing. So if anyone is interested in free photo editing from GIMP, Amy will tell you all about how to do it. Okay? We also have our book club. It's How High We Go in the Dark. This is an all Io Reads pick book. It is a novel by Sequoia Nagamatsu. It is kind of got some futuristic stuff in it, but it tells a lot about human nature in general. So if you're interested in that, we have books available. You could try to read that before our talk, which is October 30th at 6 o'clock p.m. Our movie matinee for November is Devotion. This movie is based on the true story of a friendship between two pilots during the Korean War. So it is a true story. We're having that November 8th at 2 o'clock p.m., so that is a Wednesday. Now, we're going to go down to business here. Ladies and gentlemen.
That's you.
That is you guys there. And children. Theodore Roosevelt was born in New York City, New York on October 27, 1858. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from Harvard University and was elected the youngest member of the New York General Assembly. In the years to follow, he became a cattle rancher in the Dakota Territory and ran successfully for the New York mayorship.
That was unsuccessful.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were successful in everything.
I overcame the defeat.
Unsuccessfully. He served as the United States Civil Service Commissioner, President of the Police Commission of New York City, Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy, Colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, Governor of New York, Vice President and President of the United States, all by the age of 42.
It was a pretty good start.
He was the father of 6 children and the author of over 30 books. He was a big game hunter, a leading ornithologist, and the founder of Boone and Crockett, the nation's first fair hunting and conservation organization. During his presidency, he declared some 230 million acres of national parks, national forests, wildlife refuges, and national monuments. He was indeed the great conservation president. Ladies and gentlemen, the 26th President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt.
Thank you so much. I am Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm delighted to be here at the Spencer Library. As I told one of Ms. Munson's colleagues, I said that the only thing I liked more than books were children. And here at the library, the librarians, the community, you enjoy them both. I'm also delighted to be back in Spencer. My friends David and Jane Cruz from Comstock Commodities, they hosted me here at the Clay County Fairgrounds, and always a delight to come to Spencer, for I come to you from Medora, North Dakota, gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, future home of Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, and since 1965, home to the Medora Musical. And no one's ever been appreciated and enjoyed more in the Medora Musical than your own Kim Stephan Willow, one of our Burning Hill singers. There's Mr. Stephan here to represent the family. Please, for Kim Stephan Willow. You see, I was partial to a felt hat. They pack up so nicely. I would have come more formally in my top hat, but I've been a bit disappointed of late as I've toured the country Recently, I was sprinting across a green. I had my top hat. One young man spotted me, pointed at me, and told his friends, he said, "Look, there's the Monopoly dude." If he knew his history half as well as you, he would have known I was the anti-Monopoly dude. Well, I'm afraid I might be forgotten a bit these days. But I shan't forget the people of Iowa, where the tall corn grows. I'm known as the conservation president. Could not have done my work in conservation without some of the men and women in the front lines of that effort. Do you know Tama Jim Wilson in your history? From Tama County, of course. Called Tama Jim Wilson for the fact that there was another prominent Republican from Iowa, a United States Senator, called Jefferson Jim Wilson from Jefferson County. But Tama Jim, 16 years, a cabinet officer in the presidential cabinets of President McKinley, my cabinet, and President William Howard Taft. All those years, 16 years, Secretary of Agriculture. No one's ever served in the cabinet of the President of the United States longer than Tama Jim Wilson of Tama, Iowa. Of course, it seems former Governor Vilsack, Secretary Vilsack's trying to do so in non-consecutive terms now in the same position as Secretary of Agriculture. Previous to the Transfer Act of 1905, which transferred the Bureau of Forestry from the Department of the Interior to the Department of Agriculture, previously the Bureau of Forestry, well, had been under the administration of the General Land Office in the Department of the Interior, staffed by a handful of clerks, mostly ne'er-do-well nephews and cousins of members of Congress, few if any of whom have ever seen a board foot of lumber, and most with the average intellectual capacity of a balloon. Well, under the Transfer Act of 1905, under the leadership of Tama Jim Wilson of Iowa, we transferred that Bureau of Forestry to the Department of Agriculture, staffed it with newly graduated forest rangers from the Sage School of Forestry at Yale University. One of those men to so graduate and join the Forest Service was Aldo Leopold of Iowa, famous for the Sand County Almanac, written north of Madison, Wisconsin, where he would run the Forest Service Wood Products Laboratory. A real seminal work in the middle of the 20th century with regards to the land ethic and conservation. But he, from Burlington, Iowa, in his youth, that's where he enjoyed going out and hunting the birds, as many of the men and even the women do enjoy now. Tama Jim Wilson saw to it in 1907 that we created the United States Forest Service. I'm given credit for the parks, and I'm glad, but perhaps too much credit. Our first national park? Yellowstone, right. 1872, President Grant and Congress. It took an act of Congress to name a national park. On this issue of the conservation of our natural resources, I was a progressive. And I discovered that all too often the opposite of progress was Congress. It was my own fellow Republican, Speaker of the House Joe Cannon of Danville, Illinois, along the Vermilion, who had famously said, "Not 1 cent for scenery." Well, you here know the national parks are not just scenery. The nation's wild places and playgrounds, organized on the most democratic of principles. The national parks belong to you, equally to you and to you. They belong to each and every one of us and to our children and grandchildren, too. Hence the responsibility to pass these parks on to future generations in better condition and not in worse. But I was only able to wrestle 5 national parks out of Congress during my 7½ years as your chief executive. Anyone ever been to Crater Lake National Park in Oregon? Oh, wonderful. The deepest natural lake in North America, 1,942 feet deep. An ancient volcano collapsed in its cone and filled by eons of melted snow. Little Wizard Island in its midst. Mesa Verde, the Pueblo Indian ruins in southern Colorado, another of my 5 national parks, as is Wind Cave, not all that far away in South Dakota. My 2 other national parks have reverted to other uses within the national park service or within the Department of the Interior. Platte National Park, the hot springs nearby Sulphur, Oklahoma, the village telling you what those hot springs smelled like. Cousin Franklin and Congress dammed the Chickasaw River, created Lake Arbuckle, In Oklahoma, that's now called the Chickasaw National Recreation Area, though I don't see much value in recreation if it means zooming about a quiet lake in a powerboat disturbing the birds. To each their own. My 5th national park is in North Dakota, and it's not Theodore Roosevelt National Park. I had a good sense of my own ego, but not so much that I would ask Congress to name a national park after me. My park dates to 1947 in the Truman administration. No, I'm speaking of Sully's Hill National Park, now called White Horse Hill, for that's what the Spirit Lake Dakota Sioux called the hill. A national park in my time, and you might wonder why. As bucolic as Devil's Lake and Sully's Hill is, it's no Glacier or Teton, Yellowstone or Yosemite in scope or scale. But some things in American politics have not changed. The entire time that I was your president, the chairman of the United States Senate Public Lands Committee was Senator Henry Clay Hansborough of Devil's Lake, North Dakota. I do believe you still call that bringing home the bacon. Yes. So perhaps more than the parks, I should be better known for the national forests. By the result of the Forest Reserve Act of 1893, I was able, as were all of my predecessors from that date, to declare certain public lands as national forests, forest reserves, before the creation of the Forest Service. 150 national forests named or expanded, taking the acreage under federal protection from 50 million acres to 200 million acres. And all of it impossible without the work of that man from Tama, Iowa, Jim Wilson. I mentioned Aldo Leopold. You also would know Ding Darling, the illustrator, from Des Moines professionally. Amongst the most famous, indeed the most reprinted of the illustrations, the cartoons that Ding Darling ever drew, was one he drew on January 6th, 1919. Of course, Epiphany Day on the Christian calendar, and the date of my demise. Spoiler alert, I died on that date. They dug me up for the presentation today. Ding Darling, the publisher of the newspaper, gave him the news. We were correspondent. We'd been friends out on the trail as I traveled throughout the country. He hastily drew a sketch in the moment of grief, and then went off to a day of meetings, coming back and being on deadline for the evening paper. He went with the first drawing he wrote. The drawing shows me riding off to heaven, up into the mountains, joining a Conestoga wagon train, waving my cowboy hat on horseback, at Washington, D.C. and New York in the background. That's the cartoon that ran that evening in the Des Moines newspaper. Fraser eventually would produce that as a hammered brass or a hammered copper. I've seen it in the lobby of the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City and in the lobby of Theodore Roosevelt High School in West Des Moines, Iowa. Aldo Leopold, Ding Darling, Tama Jim Wilson, but a start of the men from Iowa that were at my side during that first decade of the 20th century. We call it the American century, and I hope that the policies of the Roosevelt administration have a bit of something to do with that. I'm given credit as your conservation president, but I did not think that the most important work of my administration. I reserve that judgment for a bit of ditch digging in the Isthmus of Central America. The Panama Canal. It had been a vision of mankind since the explorations of Balboa 4 centuries prior to my administration. And because of American ingenuity, international labor, and medicine, Dr. William Crawford Gorgas eliminating yellow fever and malaria from the canal zone during his administration. When opened in 1914, the canal cut to 1/3 the amount of time necessary to move our great naval assets from one ocean to the other. Not unrelated to it, the steaming around the world of the Great White Fleet. 16 battleships painted white, the color of peace, and in circumnavigating the globe, accomplishing what no Spanish, Dutch, or English armada had ever accomplished before, and demonstrating successfully to the powers of Asia and Europe that the United States Navy could do in peacetime what might be necessary to do in wartime. But a wonder that I became your president, and that my life and legacy are associated with the great outdoors and the strenuous life that I lived and preached. For knowing your history, you likely know that I was born in New York City, New York, Then a city of 1 million souls and 500,000 horses. And the city was covered in sewerage of all sorts, and by a heavy black soot from the coal fires that we burned in the fireplaces. And far from living the strenuous life, I was a very weak and sickly child. I had asthma. Any of you who might have asthma, or if you've had asthma amongst your family or friends, you know what a terrible disease that is. To see a small child choking for breath and for life itself. Today, thankfully, the asthmatic child has the inhaler to restore breath, hopefully quickly. In my day, we had no such medicine. In my day, the treatment for asthma was worse than the disease. Can you imagine giving a small asthmatic boy a cigar to smoke? The idea was that coughing would stimulate my breathing. I was given bitter black coffee to drink, again as a stimulant. Became quite addicted to the bean as an adult. As your president, I drank 1.5 gallons of coffee each and every day. In 1907, I was traveling through Tennessee, stopped in Nashville, begged the ladies of the Hermitage Society. I said, I just need to have a meal at the general's table, General Andrew Jackson. And the ladies acquiesced, served me luncheon, spent the entire luncheon lobbying me for federal funding for new plumbing system for Old Hickory's house. I included just such a request in my subsequent State of the Union address. Congress appropriated the funds. The ladies of the Hermitage Society are still a very influential set. When I finished my luncheon, I finished my coffee. I turned to my hostess, herself a descendant of General Jackson. I said, Madam, that coffee was good to the last drop. The coffee was from the Maxwell House Hotel, downtown Nashville, Tennessee. Cheek Brothers proprietors. They tell me that after my demise, Maxwell House Coffee used illustrations of that incident, and the New Yorker, the Saturday Evening Post, sold a lot more coffee. Mind you, not a penny in royalties for the Roosevelts. Worst of all, when I had my asthma, I was given Ipecac syrup to drink. And well, I can see by the grimaces here, some of you with a bit of snow atop the peak, or perhaps not too much atop the peak, you might know Ipecac syrup. The younger generation generally knows it no longer. Boys, Ipecac syrup is something that you drink in order to see your lunch. Twice. He's got it figured out. Unpleasant memories for me to this very day. When I was a small boy of 11, my father, Theodore, the greatest man I ever knew, the man for whom I'm named, he called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the seriousness of the subject to follow, for rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known, T.D., he said, Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. Without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body. I said, Father, I shall. And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights, I swam, I rowed. I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner. And I built my body. And it does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. But when I was your president at 5'8" and 220 solid pounds, I was but a mere feather of a man compared to my successor, William Howard Taft. At times, Taft tipped the scales at over 350 pounds. When I was your president and Taft our civilian governor in the Philippines, we had word that Taft was in ill health with fever, perhaps near death. My Secretary of War, Elihu Root, cabled to the Philippines inquiring as to Taft's health, and thankfully, Taft cabled back, health fine, rode horse 20 miles this morning. Root cabled back, how's the horse? As a little boy, I did not intend to find school or academy, as most of your students do, I'm sure. I was homeschooled, and in the parlance of today, Christian homeschooled. For the most important lesson of the day was the first, when I would wait with my 3 siblings, my older sister Anna, known as Banny in the family, my younger brother Elliot, called Nell, later in history Eleanor Roosevelt's father, and our youngest sister Corinne, called Coney. We would wait at the foot of the stairs, wait to see my father come attired for his day at the office at Roosevelt and Sons, importers of plate glass from France. He would teach us our Bible devotion. And then off to work, our lessons were taught to us by my Aunt Anna Bullock, my mother's sister. She exchanged room and board for teaching us children our lessons, like my mother from Roswell, Georgia, like my grandmother Bullock, who lived with us as well. And this being the years of the horrible Civil War, there was great relief in the Roosevelt household when that terrible war came to its conclusion, though my mother remained entirely unreconstructed for decades after that war. I was good in some subjects, literature, history, natural science, very poor or average in other subjects like mathematics and Greek and Latin. But it was natural science that was my greatest joy and pleasure. Why, even in lower Manhattan, a boy and his friends could find nature. Nearby Gramercy Park, Mr. Olmsted's great Central Park, with the American Museum of Natural History on the west side. The charter for that museum was signed in the Roosevelt family living room when I was a young teenager. My father recruited its first director. It was a playground for me and the other Roosevelt children. Why, even I'm glad that some of the youngsters, they've seen a movie called Night at the Museum, where there's actually a fellow that pretends to be me. Imagine that, a man pretending to be somebody he's not. I would wander along the wharves of the East River and the Hudson River, and whether in the parks or along the rivers, I was encouraged to collect. And I collected snakes and bugs and turtles and birds, squirrels and rats and mice, alive or dead, it did not matter. My brother and I and our cousins who lived next door, we brought these creatures home and had on the 4th floor of our home something that we called Roosevelt's Museum of Natural History. A very wide-ranging, though as any mother might suspect, a truly malodorous collection. You had to be careful coming to my house. If you poured yourself a glass of water from the pitcher, a snake might fall out of the pitcher into your glass. That's where I was keeping my snake cool. If you reached into the icebox for a snack, you might pull out my collection of mice awaiting my experiments. One afternoon, I was walking up Broadway Avenue. I saw Mrs. Hamilton Fish walking down. She then, the wife of the United States Secretary of State. A very important woman. I thought I should have some display of gentlemanly conduct in hopes that a report of my gentlemanly conduct might go home to my mother, much to my own benefit. Pride before the fall. As I passed Mrs. Fish in the street, I tipped my hat and wished her a good day, and when I did so, 2 frogs fell out from beneath my hat and fell upon her shoes. I'm afraid that the report that went home was not of my gentlemanly conduct. When I was a boy of 13, I received a life-changing gift. The discovery was made when my father had given me my first gun that year. Double-barrel breech-load shotgun of French manufacture. Perfect sort of gun for a boy and his friends, for we could not break that gun. In order to open the breech, we often had to bang it with a brick. The first time I took that gun shooting birds along the Hudson River, there the discovery. My friends could shoot birds in trees, where for me the trees themselves were blurry and indistinguishable. On our return trip to the city, my friends could read billboards and advertisements at a distance where for me the words and letters were illegible. It was at that late date in my life that my father knew to have me tested and fitted for my spectacles. And how God's great creation came to life for me when I had my glasses. My drawings of birds improved greatly. My shooting of birds did not improve all that much. Perhaps like some of you, I've always made up for in volume what I lacked in accuracy. I did not shoot well, but I shot often. Usually often and well enough to bag the game. I was tutored for my entrance exam to Harvard College, today Harvard University. And you good common sense people of Iowa will understand me when I tell you I did not learn much of practical value at Harvard. My father sent me from New York City to Cambridge my freshman year by train with these words. He said, Theodore, first take care of your morals. Second, your health. Third, your studies. My father was the only man of whom I was ever really afraid. But in a good sense of the word, I never wanted to disappoint my father. You've heard I did quite well in my marks. My father came to visit me my freshman year and asked me that question that perhaps many of you have asked of a student away at school or can recall being asked by your parents. He said, Theodore, what do you plan to do with yourself professionally? I said, Father, I think I should like to be a natural scientist. He said, Theodore, that's fine, as long as you are not a dilettante, as long as you do serious work. The family had done well enough in business that my family eventually would not need to worry about its bread. If, however, Theodore, my father said, you have a taste for jam and butter, you had better get about the plan for the jam and the butter. My father taught me in this issue of home economics, if I wasn't going to do remunerative work and add to the value of the numerator of life, I must reduce my expenses and thereby reduce the denominator of life. Keep the fraction of life constant. I promise no more math in this program. Hard to put to words. what a blow it was to me my sophomore year when my father died of stomach cancer. He but a young man of 46, leaving behind his widow and 4 children. The entire city of New York was in mourning, and I was in a terribly foul mood, writing in my diary and to my siblings that I thought I might go insane from sadness. My tutor, Arthur Cutler, knew that in the past, being outdoors and having strenuous exercise had not only restored my health as an asthmatic, but very often my spirits as well. That summer he sent me to the north woods of Maine, to the great Aroostook country along the Penobscot River. And there with a hunting guide named William Sewell and his nephew Wilmot Dow, 2 men who short years later would follow me out to the Badlands. In Maine, we hunted and hiked and canoed. We climbed Katahdin, the highest point in Maine, famous today as the northern terminus of the Great Appalachian Trail. We visited the lumber camps, where my vocabulary was greatly expanded. And most mornings before we had our adventures, I took my own canoe to a place south of Iden Falls, a place where the West Branch of Lake Mattawamkeag rivers joined by First Brook. And there in the early morning lights, by the sound of those waters joining gently, I began the day the way my late father would have me do, with Bible devotion. In the years hence, the people of the state of Maine have seen fit to name that little point of land a state historic site called Bible Point, so named for the fact that I, as a young man, sought and found the wisdom, comfort, and solace of the good book there. I would later in life say that a thorough knowledge of the Bible was worth more than a college education. But I returned to Harvard to complete my college education. I threw myself into my studies, but as many a young man of that age is wont to do, I fell in love with young Alice Hathaway Lee, the most beautiful girl in Boston. She but 17 years old at the time. The cousin of a classmate of mine. They lived as neighbors some 6 miles distant from Cambridge on Chestnut Hill. And my junior year, well worn was the dog cart path between Cambridge and Chestnut Hill. So much so that in the spring of my junior year, I proposed marriage to Alice, and she refused me. In the fall of my senior year, I proposed marriage to Alice again, and she refused me again. But its doggedness is as doggedness does, persistence wins the prize. Oh, today you might call it stalking. In the spring of my senior year, Alice relented to my proposals, agreed to be my bride, made me the happiest man in the world. And now I do understand that occasionally a married man has trouble remembering the date of his wedding anniversary. I took care of this. Alice and I were married on my birthday. We honeymooned but briefly. I knew that a man's first responsibility was to pull his own weight, to provide for his family, but I'd soured on natural science as a profession, at least the way the profession was taught at Harvard in those days, where a natural scientist, rather than being an outdoorsman, was meant to be a man indoors in a laboratory coat, looking at specimens through a microscope and doing dissections. I decided to enroll in Columbia Law School, thinking to follow 2 of my late father's brothers into the practice of law, and soon became doubly frustrated at law school, where I discovered that rather than teaching a lawyer to fight for righteousness and justice, I discovered at law school a lawyer is taught to fight for a good outcome for his or her client, regardless of whether the outcome is truly righteous or just. Very likely the way the teaching and the practice of law needs to be, but not the way I wanted to spend my life professionally. Each and every day, march between home and Columbia Law, twice each day, I passed the local Republican headquarters. Not surprisingly, above the local saloon. And much to the horror of my family, who did not consider politics to be the realm of a gentleman, they said it was the realm of horse carriage drivers and saloon keepers. I said, if that's the nature of the governing class, I'd rather be a member of the governing class than be subject to being governed by men like those. The young men embraced me there. They ran me successfully for the New York General Assembly. I was elected its youngest member at the age of 23. And as I left for Albany to take the oath of office, the erroneous words of one of my cousins were still ringing in my ears. He said, Theodore, don't you understand the Greek etymology of the word politics? Poly meaning many, and ticks being blood-sucking insects. Off to Albany I went. Soon there I was known as the Cyclone Assemblyman, the man with the sun in his face. Happy indeed in great part because life offers no greater reward than working hard, work worth doing. And happier still for the fact that Alice and I were expecting our first child. Happy was the day when the telegram came to the floor in Albany. announcing that Alice and I were the parents of a healthy baby girl. Congratulations were all about. Even my political opponents were happy for me. But then a second and most ominous telegram came. That telegram sent me for the train, on the train down the Hudson Valley, racing to my family home in the middle of the night, the home in which my father had died 6 years prior. Brother Elliot answered the door with these words. He said, "There is a curse upon this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is too." On the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, 1884, my dear sweet widowed mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, the Rose of Roswell, Georgia, she died of typhoid fever, the dirty water disease. That afternoon, beneath the same roof and in my arms, my dear sweet bride Alice, she but 22, and a new mother. She died of Bright's disease, a kidney disease not quite treatable by modern medicine. There's nothing in my diary that day but a large black X. In the words, "The light has gone out of my life." I thought forever. A friend wrote of the twin funeral 2 days later, "Theodore knows neither what he does nor says." But I was a man of the Christian faith, and my faith told me my loved ones were not gone, but rather gone before. And I took courage from the words of my late father, who said, "Dark care seldom sits behind the rider whose pace is swift enough. Get action." Action I got. I had the baby named Alice for her late mother, cared for by my sister Anna, Bammy. Anna, 28 years old, not married. We called that a spinster in those days, an old maid. Now, Anna could have that which she previously could not, a family, not much in the way of promise and issues matrimonial for Anna. Since her small childhood, a deformity, a hunchback, a curvature of the spine that we now believe to be tuberculosis of the spine. My sister Anna, married at the age of 40, gave birth to my nephew at the age of 43. Some historians say she would have been a better president than her brother. I do not dispute the theory. 2 days after the funeral, I was back on the floor in Albany, New York. Some nights spending the night sleepless, throwing myself into my work, writing by hand 6 or 7 bills a night. The session completed, I returned to New York City and saw to family affairs. Took the train west to Chicago and participated in my first Republican National Convention, leading the effort successfully with Henry Cabot Lodge to see the first man of color, Congressman John Lynch of Mississippi, a former slave, seated as a temporary chairman of a great national party convention, Lincoln's Party. The convention over, I did not return east to New York City, but took the train so much further west to where the newly constructed Northern Pacific Railroad crossed the Little Missouri River in the Badlands of what was then Dakota Territory, where the previous fall, in the after excitement of a successful bison hunt, I'd written a check for $14,000 to purchase 450 head of cattle and to hire men to be my cattle ranch foreman. I was now a cattle rancher. Now, I would later in life say that I would have never been president but for my experiences in North Dakota, and wrote of my experiences there that it was in those Badlands that the romance of my life began. And now some 700,000 people a year come out to the Badlands of North Dakota to visit Theodore Roosevelt National Park, to see the bison and the elk and the feral horses and the bighorn sheep up in the North Unit. And I invite each and every one of you to come and enjoy our hospitality in the year ahead. Now, I was appointed a United States Civil Service Commissioner by President Benjamin Harrison. I would serve in that position for 6 years, doing such a good job of fighting against corruption within Harrison's Republican regime that the Democrat Grover Cleveland, who'd been governor when I was a young member of the General Assembly, he reappointed me to the position. And then I fought corruption in the Democratic regime just as well. I was appointed in 1896 to be the police commissioner in New York City. One of 4 members of that board, I was elected by the others to be the president. Now, of course, if you watch Tom Selleck in Blue Bloods, well, you'll see that he often quotes me and has a picture of me on his office wall as commissioner of police in New York City. A bit of a fiction, but it wasn't a fiction that I fought against crime and corruption in New York City. First, trying to root out corruption within the police force itself. Most police officers purchase their position and kicked back a portion of their salary to the ward heeler that saw the appointment made. As police commissioner, I instituted civil service reforms, saw to it that in order to be hired or promoted as a New York City police officer, one actually had to be able to read and write. We issued standard firearms, a Colt. It's the beginning of the second police academy in the United States during my administration. We put men on bicycles and called them wheelmen. They chased down the runaway horses and carriages. And we hired the first uniformed police women in New York City history during my administration. I got into a bit of a dust-up when I wanted to see that the laws were enforced. There was one law that was not enforced that was a source of corruption, the Sunday Blue Law. It required that taverns where they sold brewed or distilled spirits be closed on the Sabbath, on Sunday. But while the front door and the front window might say closed, the alley door often remained open. And the police officer subject to a payment from the tavern owner. New York City then, a city of men of German and Irish and Italian descent, working 6 days a week, they thought it their presidential right to drink in public on the 7th. I said it would be better if they spent the day at home with their wife and children. I saw to it that the taverns were closed on Sundays. The New York Times reported it was the driest summer in New York City history. The tavern owners were a very influential set. New York City, not then a home rule municipality, they went to Albany and had the state laws of jurisdiction changed such that any tavern that had on its premises 10 or more beds would be considered an inn and would be exempt from the law. I can only tell you that adding 10 beds to the typical tavern in New York City had certain unintended consequences. It was during my time as police commissioner that a hateful German minister came to New York City, was scheduled to spread his anti-Semitic venom at Carnegie Hall. The leadership of the Jewish community came and asked me if I might prevent the man from speaking. I explained our First Amendment, said I had no right whatsoever to prohibit the man from speaking, but I did have a way that I would try to impact the event and send a message to that preacher and any that might be sympathetic to his hateful viewpoints. I went and addressed the audience waiting to see the speaker that evening at Carnegie Hall. I said that peace and decorum will be maintained during this presentation. And that in order to make sure that that is so, 40 of New York City's finest police officers would be responsible. And that's why Officer Goldberg and Officer Leichheim and Officer Goldwitz, 40 of the finest Jewish police officers stood in guard of that man, and I think the message was properly sent. I took up my position at the United States Navy during McKinley's first administration. The number 2 man at the Navy, the thing that I enjoyed about being the Assistant Secretary of the Navy is that every time that the elderly former governor of Massachusetts, the Secretary of the Navy, John Long, when he was away from the nation's capital, it left me as the acting secretary in the pilot house of the Navy. With others, I thought that war with Spain was likely in Cuba. And when the battleship Maine was blown up in Havana Harbor that February 15th, 1898, I did not hesitate. I called it an act of Spanish treachery. Meanwhile, Congress and the McKinley administration wished to investigate and be very careful about any action taken on behalf of the Cuban rebels or on behalf of American interests vis-a-vis Spain and Cuba. I lobbied Congress. If a war came, I wanted to be in it. My sister wrote that the only black mark I held against my father was that during the Civil War he paid a substitute to fight in his place, as many a gentleman of that day did. He found another way to serve. He could not take up arms against his wife's family, he thought. He became an allotment commissioner during the war. Indeed, lobbied for the acceptance of that legislation during the Lincoln administration. Well, I wound up being lieutenant colonel of the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. History remembers us as the Rough Riders. I was offered command of the regiment, and in a rare circumstance of professional humility, I asked that my friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, the White House surgeon, he for whom the Army fort in Missouri is named, I asked that he be the commanding officer. I thought I might need a week or 2 of combat experience in order to lead the regiment. We trained and mustered in San Antonio. We went on to Tampa, Florida. Word came in late June of 1898 that we were now going to depart and be amongst the first troops to land in Cuba. Sad the day was, 1/3 of the Rough Riders would be left behind. All of the horses for the enlisted men would be left behind. Our mules transferred to a regular regiment. Only the officers were allowed to bring our horses. As we left Tampa Harbor, we toasted the regimental toast. To the officers, may the war last long enough that we're all either wounded, killed, or promoted. And we were. Our 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry took more casualties than any other volunteer regiment in Cuba, more than all but 2 of the regular regiments. 20% of the enlisted men wounded or killed, 30% of the officers. Not for any lack of training or ability, but for the fact that we always rushed to the sound of the guns. July 1st, 1898, my crowded hour. Because of illnesses amongst the general officership, many of the generals, too fat or sick with gout to get off the boats, Colonel Wood took command of the brigade, and I now had command of the regiment. The only man on horseback in that section of the line, I did not yell charge. I rode before the men and said, "Gentlemen, follow me." I was lucky to get into the war, lucky to get out of it, and lucky to rise like a rocket shortly thereafter. Quarantined at Montauk Point, Long Island after the war in August and September, the Republican bosses sent an emissary to see if I would be willing to accept the Republican nomination for the governorship that year. I made my bargain with the devil. I said I would accept the nomination, but if elected, I would be my own man. I would consult the party leaders on policy and appointments, but in the final analysis, each and every one would be my own. I was narrowly elected over the Democrat Van Wyck that fall. I set about delivering a square deal for the people of New York. When 1900 rolled around, I wished to be re-elected to another 2-year term. But I'd done too much square dealing for those Republican bosses. They decided to send me away. You've heard of the New England mother. She had 2 sons. One became a ship's captain out to sea. The other became Vice President of the United States. And neither was ever heard from again. They thought they were sending me to a dead end in my political career, and I thought I was going on one myself. I campaigned that election year 1900, 16,000 miles by train. And that's where Ding Darling and I first crossed paths in Iowa when he was on the beat. McKinley famously campaigned from his front porch in Canton, Ohio. We bested William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of New York, making his 2nd attempt at the presidency, and Adlai Stevenson, the former vice president from Illinois, the grandfather of the later Democratic nominee. When we were elected, Mark Hanna, chairman of the Republican National Committee, President McKinley's mentor, he told President McKinley, "Your job is to stay alive for 4 years." He told his fellow Republicans, "Don't you realize what you've done? That madman cowboy is but 1 life from the presidency." Sadly prophetic, those words. September 6th again, 1901. President McKinley greeting visitors at the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York. I about to address a fish and game dinner at Isle La Motte, Lake Champlain, Vermont. The phone rang. It was bad news from Buffalo. President McKinley had been shot twice. Once in the sternum, the bullet bouncing off of his chest. The other time in the abdomen. It would prove a fatal shot. But not quickly so. I raced from Vermont to be by his side. And after some days, the cabinet, assured by the physicians that the president would recuperate from the gunshot wound, the cabinet decided it would do the nation's anxiety and Wall Street's anxiety some good if I went on a planned vacation with my family in my beloved Adirondack Mountains. Coming down from Mount Marcy in the Adirondacks, the highest point in New York, having lunch at Lake Tear-the-Clouds, oxtail on knife point from the can. There, a hunting guide known to me racing up with what was the bad news from Buffalo, that the president was dying, and I was needed there. Unfortunately for President McKinley, the 2 physicians treating his gunshot wounds were both gynecologists, neither of whom had ever treated a gunshot wound in his practice. By the time I reached the train station at North Creek Depot, there waited for me that September 14th morning a telegram from John Hayes, Secretary of State, in his youth Lincoln's secretary, with the news from Buffalo that the president had died while I was down route from the mountain. I hope there's something of my 7 1/2 years as your president that you might still appreciate. I've listed a bit of the legacy. Perhaps the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to me for settling the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, is something you might recall. I mentioned the forests and the parks. There's another Iowa man, Congressman John Fletcher Lacey of Oskaloosa, Iowa. He gave us the Lacey Act in 1900. It made it a federal crime to hunt game illegally in one state and transport that ill-gotten game across state lines. In 1906, he gave us the Monuments and Antiquities Act, which delegated from Congress to the President the executive authority to name certain public lands of historic, prehistoric, or scientific interest as national monuments. I first used the power the 18 times I did so to declare Devil's Tower in Wyoming a national monument. Mount Olympus in Washington, later expanded by Cousin Franklin in Congress to be Olympic National Park. Lassen Volcano in California, Montezuma's Castle in Arizona, Jewel Cave in South Dakota. And in 1908, when Congress still refused to name the Grand Canyon a national park, which I had requested year after year since I first saw it in 1903, I wrote an executive order naming the entire Grand Canyon a national monument. I said Congress would eventually come about its senses, which they did in the final weeks of the Wilson administration. About the only thing that fellow got right. In the immediate aftermath of my executive order, Congress turned handsprings in their wrath. The aforementioned Joe Cannon said of me, President Roosevelt has as much use for the Constitution as a tomcat has for a marriage license. I said the Constitution's made for the people, not the people for the Constitution. I had my battles with Congress, and sometimes, well, for example, the greatest conservation legislation of all passed during my administration, mostly forgotten today. 1902, the Newlands Reclamation Act created the Reclamation Service, dammed 30 western rivers, irrigated millions of previously arid acres, and provided for the settlement thereon by farmers and ranchers. Most of the reservoirs creating hydroelectricity, or themselves now being national wildlife refuges, indispensable to the health of the migratory fowl in the Midwest and Western flyways. The sponsor? John Newlands, a silver Democrat, a member of the House from Reno, Nevada. You see, back in my day, there was this ancient archaic concept of bipartisanship. We used to be able to get things done, both Republicans and Democrats working together for the betterment of the country. Perhaps happy days will be here again when we can do that again for the country. Well, I have prattled on now. I told you I would tell a story before I concluded. I think I'm actually best remembered not for the legacy of success and achievement, but for the legacy of a failure, a particular failure, a failed bear hunt in the delta of the Mississippi River in 1902. When I refused to shoot an adult male bear, about 180 pounds, it had been a drought, but the bear had been wounded by hunting dogs, and my hunting guide had actually broken the barrel of his gun across the bear's head. The bear was bleeding from a great gash and wound in his head, and then my hunting guide tied that bear to a tree. When I arrived on the scene, my horror was compounded when one of my hunting party said, "Mr. President, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." What a cowardly thing that would have been to do, to shoot a wounded and tied animal. Of course, I refused to do so. The story embarrassingly spread throughout the country. And another cartoonist, a friend of mine and Ding's, Clifford Berryman, he drew his cartoons for the Washington Post. He drew a cartoon of the incident, called it Drawing the Line in Mississippi. The cartoon showed me refusing to shoot a small bear cub tied to a tree. When I returned to the White House, I received there a letter from the Michtom family, small candy makers, toy manufacturers in Brooklyn, New York. Mrs. Michtom in her letter to me asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back, I said, you may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all. Apparently the sales of what they called Teddy's bear with the apostrophe possessive S were pretty good, because the Michtoms became the world famous Ideal Toy Company of New York City, New York. The toy manufacturers, enthused by the unexpected profits that came from the sale of Teddy's bear, they thought they might equally profit if they made a stuffed animal and named it in honor of each and every subsequent resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. But I'm afraid, in honor of William Howard Taft and for the toy manufacturers, America's mothers never really took kindly to putting Billy the Possum in with the children. The teddy bear reigned supreme. And now, I hope the boys aren't too disappointed, but boys, Mr. Steffens got his granddaughter visiting. And she's known as Junebug as a nickname. Her name is June Willow. Who knows, maybe a future Burning Hills singer like her mother.
Possibly.
That's for June, all right?
All right. Thank you.
Terrific. You're welcome. Bully. That's an incentive for a politician to keep talking. Take a short break, I'll start the second half of the program. But instead, I'll remind you that I was the first president to make permanent office space available for members of the press at the White House. Something I'm sure many of my successors deeply regret. But I would be remiss if I didn't take a question or comment. There's so many stories untold, and I'm happy to complete by telling a few, but any question or comment that anyone has at all, please.
Did you never remarried?
I did, and I think I can share with you that when I was out in the Badlands, hunting, ranching, somebody here probably knows there's nothing so good for the inside of a man or a woman as the outside of a horse. I healed in the Badlands. I would write my sisters in New York City, informing them that I would come to see to family affairs and avoid some of the bitterest of the Dakota winter. In those letters to my sisters, I instructed them that when I visited, under no circumstance should an old childhood sweetheart, Edith Carroll, be anywhere about. I was a Victorian, and I did not approve of second marriages, and I did not want to be tempted. And thank goodness, sisters don't always do what brothers ask them to do. On one return visit there in the parlor was Edith. We began to see each other socially, became secretly engaged. And nearly 3 years after my first wife's sad passing, Edith and I eloped and were married at St. George's, Hanover Square, London, England. Returning to the United States 9 months and 3 weeks after the wedding, Ted Jr. was born. The first of 5 children that Mrs. Roosevelt and I would have together. We took the baby Alice back into our care when she was but a toddler, breaking my sister Pammy's heart. But fast forwarding through history, I wonder if you realize then, in later years of the White House, Mrs. Roosevelt and I reared 6 children there. Mrs. Roosevelt claimed she reared 7 children there, that I was her worstest and most terrible child. And one story about my eldest, my daughter Alice, 17 when we entered the White House. Her behavior, scandalous. We would have sent her away to finishing school, but she said that she'd create such a fuss and scandal that we'd regret doing so. It's one of the few times that I didn't call someone's bluff. She would spend most of our White House years gallivanting out in Washington, D.C. parties or jet-setting with her friends in Newport, Rhode Island, and like Great Gatsby. Alice, 17, she smoked cigarettes in public, flirted with Army and Navy officers. When the White House punch was discovered spiked, we knew who the culprit was. Alice kept a snake in her purse and introduced the snake as Emily Spinach at diplomatic dinners and receptions, sometimes wearing that little green snake as a bracelet around her wrist or a necklace around her neck. Oh, I tried. I put my foot down. I said, Alice, no daughter of mine will smoke beneath my roof. Alice was often seen smoking on the White House roof. During an afternoon conference with an old friend, Alice continuously and exuberantly interrupted. Finally, in exasperation, my friend said, Mr. President, can't you control your daughter, Alice? I said, sir, I can either run the country or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both. Alice was famously married at the White House in 1906 to Congressman Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, Ohio. He in the future is Speaker of the United States House, the Longworth House office building, his namesake. He died in 1931 in office during the Hoover administration. My daughter Alice outlived all of her younger siblings, living to the age of 96 in the final year of the Carter administration. And I do believe her personality delightfully summed up by a needlepoint message that was on a pillow on her settee. The message on the pillow said, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit next to me. I think we all know someone like Alice. Sir.
You tripped on the Amazon.
The River of Doubt, or in Portuguese, the Rio da Dúvida. 1913, 1914, my last chance to be a boy. Almost killed me, and likely shortened my life. When I left the White House, I was but 50 years old. I had 6 children, a growing number of grandchildren, and there was no presidential pension. The pension came into law when Congress discovered that President and Mrs. Truman were spending their meager savings purchasing letterhead, envelopes, and stamps to reply to the thousands of congratulatory letters they received in their retirement in Missouri. So I was a working man. I edited the Outlook magazine. I wrote newspaper articles and books, and I made speeches in exchange for remuneration. I've never made Clinton money, but I'm doing all right. I was invited by a South American educational foundation to tour the ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, to make speeches and to earn a fee. Mrs. Roosevelt came with me on the civilized portions. I do a little collecting out on the Mato Grosso. Some scientists would be provided. We added Uruguay and Paraguay to the itinerary, and en route, the Brazilian government decided to augment the invitation. 2 years prior, Colonel Rondon, Candido Rondon, of the Brazilian Army, he the head of the Telegraphic Commission, he and his men had spread the first telegraphic wire across the Amazon, and in doing so, with the death and desertion of many from the army, he had discovered the headwaters of a mighty river that appeared nowhere on the Brazilian Army maps, hence his naming it the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt, not knowing where it went. I was asked if I would like to join Colonel Rondon on the Roosevelt-Rondon expedition to map this previously uncharted river. Mrs. Roosevelt took my son Kermit to the side. The boy who had hunted with me in Africa was now working professionally in South America on railroad and banking interests. She pulled him to the side and said, "You must go along and keep an eye on father." It was most calamitous. By the time we crossed the Mato Grosso, nearly all of our oxen had died. Every professional that wasn't subject to the orders of the Brazilian Army had deserted the effort. We left behind equipment and rations. By the time we bartered for heavy dugout canoes at the headwaters of the River of Doubt, why, we were already on quarter rations. We thought we might hunt for game for the table as we'd done in Africa, but the game was so scarce and the jungle so dense, occasionally a howling monkey or a snake to eat, but nothing in the way of real game. And as for fishing in the river was full of piranha, more likely to eat us than we they. One man drowned. Another Brazilian trooper, being caught for the second time stealing rations, he murdered one of his officers, ran off into the jungle, surely to his own demise, for we were surrounded by people of the Sinterlargo tribes, the Wide Belt tribes, some of whom still practiced human cannibalism and hunted their human quarry with poison darts. I dashed my leg to the bone trying to save some canoes from being busted up, and shortly thereafter developed a malarial fever. The only thing we had for the treatment was quinine, quite insufficient. I lay for 2 days in the bottom of a canoe, 2 days and a night, while the entire safari was in peril. Our only chance for salvation, hoped for civilization downstream. I always took with me enough morphine to take my own life, in case of a terrible gun accident or bear mauling. I never wanted to be a fatal burden to my party, which I threatened to be on this particular trip. With a 105-degree fever, I recited over and over again in my delirium a favorite line from Coleridge. "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. In Xanadu..." Sir, after 2 days of that, I would have shot me. But my son Kermit said, "Father, I'm going to take you out of this jungle alive or dead, and it will be marginally easier to do so if you remain alive." With those words, Kermit saved my life. I recuperated. We completed our mapping. When we reached the Madeira, there a Brazilian Army contingent awaited after we'd gotten through some of the more remote rubber tapping operations. And they informed us that while en route, the Brazilian government had decided to change the name of the Rio da Dúvida to the Rio Roosevelt. The locals call it the Theodore for short, and the Kermit, one of its tributaries. I put the family name on the map of South America. I died of a coronary embolism, a blood clot in the lung. Physicians have told me that one of the effects of recurrent malarial fever, which I would suffer the rest of my years, is a dissipation of the blood, more likely to coagulate and clot, not aided by the fact that when I was a little boy and did my taxidermy, I played around with mercury and arsenic without the benefit of gloves, so probably had a bit of blood poisoning that contributed to the clotting factor. I never mind paying the piper if I had a good dance. Now, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet planted firmly on the ground. Believe you can, and you're halfway there. for Spencer, for Clay County, for Iowa, for the Republic in the days and years ahead. Do what you can with what you have where you are. Godspeed and welcome. Thank you very, very much for being here.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I wish that you drive home safely and come back to other programs at the library that we have here.
My honor and pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to stay after and visit if you've got an opportunity. Terrific. Thank you kindly. Real pleasure.